Welcome to Deep Transformation, Self-Society Spirit. I'm Roger Walsh, and our co-host is John Dupuy. And our conversation today is about the transformation that our culture has been undergoing in a much-needed way over the last few decades in its attitude and treatment of the dying. For so long, our culture hid death and dying from our presence, shoved the dying away in secluded places, and basically tried to admit it wasn't happening. That's been changing in fortunate ways, and one of the people leading that change is Frank Ostaseski. Frank is with us today, and he is the founder of the Zen Hospice, the San Francisco Zen Hospice. He also initiated the Metta training program, Metta, the Buddhist term for loving kindness, which is a training program for end-of-life care counselors. He's also author of the incredible book, The 5 Invitations, Discovering What Death Can Teach Us About Living Fully, a book I'll have more to say about because I'm absolutely blown away by it. But Frank, welcome. It's a delight to have you with us. And thank you so much. And perhaps we can begin by going back and asking, what was it that drew you into your work with the dying? Because this was very unusual when you started.
Well, first of all, nice to be with you, Roger, and with John as well. Well, who knows what gets us to one particular place, right? So many causes and conditions contribute to where we are in a given moment. You know, my own parents died when I was quite young, so that was a big influence. I worked with refugees in Chiapas in southern Mexico, where I saw a lot of horrible dying, another great big influence. The AIDS epidemic in San Francisco, where I had lots of friends dying, horrible deaths, actually, awful deaths, many times. Kubler-Ross was an important mentor. So all of these things, I think, contributed to my work. But mostly I thought there was a natural match, Roger, between people cultivating what we might call the listening mind through meditation, and people who really needed to be heard at least once in their lives, folks who were dying. And what might it be like if they were dying surrounded by love and calmness rather than fear? Yeah.
Yeah, a beautiful question. And a question it seems like that has guided your life.
Well, it's an influence, of course. I like to stay humble around these kinds of things. We'll see what it's like for me when my time comes. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that is, of course, is the test for us all. And John, you've actually faced that.
Yeah, a few years ago, I don't know, like 5 or 6 years ago, something like that. I was in Grand Junction, Colorado, on the road with my dog. And I went to the gym that I work out when I go there. And coming out of the gym, I had this massive heart attack. And I'd never had a heart attack, but this was not subtle. It was like I was in great pain. So the first thing I thought about, I've got to get back and make sure my dog is taken care of. So like an idiot, I didn't dial 911. I drove in this old person going really slow for 3.8 miles to get back to my hotel room. And I got there and I had met the manager before and she loved dogs. And so, okay. Then I called once I got back with my dog to that. And yeah, it was, I was pretty sure I was going to die. Certainly felt like it. And I was just like, well, okay, God, this is it. Here I am. And there wasn't that much fear. I was trying to say, just forgive me and help me to forgive and, all these things. But basically, God and that sort of thing was on my mind. And then they put a stent in my heart and it just like opened up. I could breathe again. I said, wow. I said, you guys just saved my life. Thank you so much. And then I had for about an hour and a half after that, a great sense of clarity, psychologically and spiritual. And I was at great peace. And I said, maybe I'm getting ready to die. I hear that happens sometimes before people die. And nope. So I called some people to said, I'm sorry. Forgive me for not being in touch. My brother, for one. And then after that, it felt like a mule had kicked me in the chest. And I was like, oh, okay, this is what it's like. And it became very difficult. But I had very little fear except for my dog, her being abandoned. And when I was in the operating room, that it was Grand Junction, Colorado, and had a great Catholic hospital cardiac center there. So it was any place on my trip, I would have died, no question. But I was right there at the right place in the right time. So there was acceptance and peace, and uh, just trying to forgive and ask for forgiveness of people I had offended or had offended me, and clear up with that. So it's always been very, very on my shoulder, very close to me ever since then, because once you have that experience, it's before and after, and so I'm very, very, very happy to be here with you, because I've been listening to your presence a lot on YouTube, and I feel I have gained a lot, and I have a lot to learn with you. So anyway, thank you for asking, Frank.
So John, may I ask you another question? I saw a kind of tenderness that came over your face when you talked about forgiveness for a moment, forgiving your brother and forgiving. So I'm curious about how this experience has stayed with you now. I mean, you spoke about the initial impact that it had, but how is it with you now? Because it's been some time.
Yeah, well, sometimes it changes. Sometimes I'm seeing a place where it seems very okay, and other times I'm just a human being that's going to die, and it's scary because I don't know exactly what's going to happen. So I seem to alternate between those two. And right now I'm at this moment with you, with everyone here, I'm feeling at peace with it. For whatever, because of the transmission or the field that's created, or who knows why. But I've been through fear of mortality, and at peace with it. And I had an experience one time. I'll just give this. I was in a deep meditative, prayerful state, and sometimes it feels like I'm just in a place where I can ask any question. The oracles are open, and I said, "Okay, God, it's a big one. What about death?" And the answer that came, that's really sustained me, was, "I will be there. Not me, but God will be there." And I said, "Well, that's enough. That's all I need to know. That's more than enough for an answer." So I don't, you could make of that what you will, but that has, I always go back to that. And there was not a lot of fear when I thought I was dying. It was like, okay, here I am, and God help me. I should have done better, but help me to clear it up in the next few minutes while I'm in this body to anything that I'm left behind.
Well, thank you, John. I mean, as you know, I had a series of heart attacks and strokes as well, and we won't go into an organ recital, but after those experiences, I read the works of people who'd also had heart attacks, just so I could understand. Abe Maslow, had a very big one, and he said the encounter with death makes love, passionate love, more possible. Yeah. And I love that was his takeaway, if you will. That was what kind of stayed with him after these, what were frightening experiences, of course. Yeah.
And I'm struck that both of you have been through these really looking death in the face. You, Frank, on several occasions, and both of you are deep contemplative practitioners, and I wonder how has that shaped or molded the way you are able to be with death, your own and with the many, many people you've sat with, Frank?
Well, I've had a few trial runs, as we were speaking about a moment ago. I mean, this happened to me just a few months ago, Roger, as you know. And I was having a kind of pain, and I got up out of bed, not quite knowing what's happening, and I sat on this little chair in my home. And honestly, Roger, my mind was like a barking junkyard dog. It was just all over the place, and all of my meditative tricks and of the trade, so to speak, weren't very useful. And then I just began to remember the people I love. And that was a kind of stabilizing influence on me. And then I could draw my attention back to the contemplative practices that you and I are familiar with. And there my mind became a little bit more stable, yeah? And I could take action that was appropriate at that point, call 911. But the truth is, I was in complete denial about the experience. And I don't think that's uncommon. John just referenced that as well. I don't think that's uncommon because I think our sense of self, our egoic self, can't really conceptualize its dying. I mean, we can conceptualize it, we can think about it, but it's not enough to help us meet this experience. It just can't do it. And so we have to discover something in ourselves that includes ourselves, but is larger than ourselves, we could say. Yeah? Only that can help us meet this experience. So,
was there a lot of fear for you when you were going through this experience?
At times there was, at other times no. In another experience, I had a rather severe stroke. And what I noticed, John, was that while it felt like someone was taking a jackhammer to my head, I got up and I couldn't find my way to the bathroom in my house, which is only 10 feet away. Yeah? And I wandered in that 10 feet. And then I began to notice that my ability to tell night from day was going offline. My ability to find direction certainly was going offline. But awareness was present. Awareness was there. And even though the functionality of my brain was not what it ought to be, awareness was conscious of that. And so in moments there was fear, of course, but there was also awareness. And I don't like to prop myself up as anything special. I just think that's the nature of awareness. And it's trustworthy. Yeah, trustworthy.
Yeah. Yeah. And that your contemplative practice, it seems, has been central to the way you've been able to approach the dying. It just feels, as I read into your book or into your being, it just feels like there's something about all those years of contemplative practice which has been enabled you to be present in a way in which most people aren't.
Well, perhaps, although I want to add here, Roger, that I've been with 1,000 or 2,000 people going through their dying process. Many of them were people who had no inner life practice, who had no contemplative practice to speak of, and yet the experience of dying introduced them to something that had them seeing themselves as something larger than the small separate self they'd taken themselves to be. So I would suggest here that dying has about it certain conditions which are conducive, helpful to our waking up, to our discovering ourselves to be more than our small separate selves, yeah? And so that's why I want to say that dying is not predominantly a medical event, and we ought to stop treating it as if it were, you know? We should bring the best of medicine to the care of the dying, but dying can't be managed by medicine alone. It's too large for that model. It's too profound for any single model, yeah? It can't show us, it can't help us to see all that death has to teach us. So I would want to stop compartmentalizing death, cutting it off from life, yeah? Suppose we imagine death as this unprecedented opportunity for transformation that helped. What would happen if we turned toward death and said, please tell us, what do you have to teach us? Yeah.
Yeah.
So that interests me, yeah.
Yeah. And of course, that's what you've discovered there and just communicated to us is very congruent with the teachings of not one, but several of the world's great spiritual traditions, that death, from their perspective, is one of the most important events in life.
Yeah.
And has that profound spiritual potential that you pointed to.
Yeah.
What are the kind of transformations you've seen people go through?
Oh boy, that's a big question, Roger. What I think I've seen oftentimes is in the final months of life, the final weeks of life, days, minutes of life, this sense of discovery that we've been, chatting about here, where people, not unlike what John was just talking about earlier, see what's really important, find what really matters, and we might say too late, and I would agree, we shouldn't need this until we find ourselves on our own deathbeds. But the point is, if that opportunity, if that understanding can emerge in the time of dying, well then, isn't it available to us now? And why wait until the time of our dying to discover it? Yeah. So, yeah, I don't want to rattle on too much here, but I think that, Kubler-Ross was one of my mentors early on, and she, of course, developed her famous 5 stages of grief, which people applied to the dying. She never meant them to be literal, I don't think. But the final, you remember, was acceptance. And it's been my experience in our contemporary medical care, including very good hospice care, that oftentimes we are pushing people toward acceptance. And thinking or imagining that it's some final stage. I think acceptance is just a beginning. I think when we accept, usually it just means we're accepting that we're mortal. We come to terms with this undeniable experience. But that's just a beginning. What I've seen frequently after this stage of acceptance are appreciably deeper states. When the ego structure comes into contact with acceptance, it freaks out. It's not a pleasant experience. It's not all warm and fuzzy. It's often chaotic. There's this sense of, being pulled apart, or everything, all the ways we've defined ourselves as being stripped away in this process. And it's frightening for most people.
I'll just add to that. Just talking to you here is bringing me back to experience. But I don't remember. Finally, they got me to the emergency room. Went to the ambulance. All the stuff that's going on, and I wasn't scared, and the experience was not traumatic for me. That I've kept this fear of my mortality. It came up later in my ego. But in that moment, it was okay, and I was like, I'm a God guy. Okay, I'm not a Buddhist though. I've been blessed by Buddhism and in my practices and whatnot. But I was my mind and heart was on God, and obviously the first thing was my love for my dog, and then family or any business that I'd left. So I was praying really hard to to release that or do anything good I could just through prayer. But it was acceptance and God-centric, and there was no fear until later on. And I realized what happened, and I've become very much aware of death. So sometimes my ego gets really scared of it. But in the moment when it was happening, I was very much on what matters, the people and my dog, the people that I loved, and God,
Well, John, acceptance is important. Acceptance of impermanence in our day-to-day life helps us to learn how to die. I think it also reveals the flip side of loss, which is that letting go is also an act of generosity. When we let go of old grudges, we give ourselves to peace. That often happens to people in and around the time of their dying. When we let go of fixed views of who we are, we give ourselves to not knowing. When we let go of all our self-sufficiency, we give ourselves into the care of others. So letting go has an important and beautiful role in this process of dying. But I think that there's a deeper dimension to this, and I think it arises out of the chaos that I was describing, the fear that you were speaking to just a moment ago. And that's the role of surrender. And I don't think it's the same thing as letting go. I think that letting go has this quality of being released, from some previous, idea of restraint, we could say. But it has this way of distancing ourselves from something. We set something down, right? Surrender is different. Surrender has this quality of coming closer to something perhaps that we already have a taste of or have some familiarity with. Yeah? And surrender, to me at least, and being around people who are dying, it has a different quality. It has a quality of expansion, actually. So the freedom that comes with that isn't exactly by setting something down, but rather becoming larger so that it can include whatever is occurring, including the fear that you're just describing. So I think that out of this chaos can often come this possibility of surrender, again, infinitely deeper than letting go. And in that surrender then becomes a kind of gateway to the possibility for transformation, to see things in a new way. Where it's not just, some activity that's being tacked onto the same old you. You are changing. You are being reconstituted in this experience of surrender. And I'll say one more thing about this. We might think of surrender as, the result of religious practice or faith or inner life work, all of which is true. Those are remarkable contributors to the possibility of surrender. But I also think that exhaustion is one of the greatest contributors to the experience of surrender. I mean, if we think about those of us who have been on meditation retreats and the like, oftentimes what happens is that we're just too bloody tired to continue. We're tired of fighting with the pain in our body. We're tired of, struggling with the chaos in our minds, and we finally just give up. We cease to battle against the situation, and that's the doorway of surrender. And then the veils lift, and all kinds of things are possible. And I think in the case of dying, that's exactly what happens. So we get too exhausted. The body can't fight anymore. The sense of self just is too damn tired to keep it all going, and it starts to get exhausted. And out of that experience, oftentimes, emerges the experience of surrender. Yeah?
Beautiful. Thank you, Frank. And it does feel like you're pointing to something both more than and possibly beyond simple acceptance. And the word surrender is the term that's most commonly used and valuable, but also feels like for many people has negative connotations. And you're pointing to something beyond those negative connotations. You're pointing to something which I'm looking for a further terms, perhaps an opening to, but something that comes out of no longer being able to maintain the ego structure and the beliefs and positions and attachments, etc., that we've cobbled together for perhaps a lifetime. And the discovery that holding our ego act together really is a lot of work.
Yes, it sure is. And in the dying process, you have this, again, I want to suggest, and I'm not romantic about dying at all. I think it's the hardest work we'll ever do. So I don't have some new age notions about dying. But the process of dying strips us of our identities, or we gracefully give them up, but they all go at some juncture. Yeah? And then who are we? Then what's there? What's left? And I think that's a really interesting point or moment in the dying process. Yeah, Roger, I was rafting down through the Grand Canyon once, and in these big, wonderful rapids that are there, and I got thrown out of the raft. And into a kind of whirlpool that started to take me down, and I did all the wrong things. I tried to swim to the edge of the whirlpool as if it were the edge of a pool and I could climb out. They threw me ropes and I couldn't get to them. I did all the wrong things. And finally the whirlpool took me down. And it took me down, and it was not a beautiful moment of dying. It was chaotic, and the water was muddy, and I couldn't find myself. It was like being in some giant washing machine. And I fought and fought and fought until finally I was too exhausted to keep fighting. And then something released, and it wasn't beautiful. It dragged me down to the bottom of the river and pulled me along the bottom of along the mud and rocks. But there was some moment of releasing that happened in that. I can't say that it was graceful. And eventually it dragged me down the river and brought me into an eddy and spit me out into the shoreline. And I felt like I emerged with a different set of eyes, actually. Now, I'm not a big believer in near-death experiences. I don't think that's what happened to me. I think I almost drowned. That's as clear as I could be about it, yeah? But it helped me to understand later when I would be with dying people, and Barbara would say, I'm just putting my head in the lap of Jesus, or, not my job anymore. Or they would say things like this to me, and I would begin to understand something of what they were talking about. Yeah? Some deep relaxation, I could say. Yeah? And I think that this is another way of us understanding surrender. It's not just as a giving up, or that we're losing the battle, but rather that we're not fighting. And so we have the opportunity to see more of who we are. See more of the experience, because our vision isn't just focused on keeping it all going. Yeah.
I have a question for you, Frank. Do you often feel when you're talking or you're teaching to us like now that sometimes you're talking to your own soul? In other words, you're giving yourself the medicine that you need. I had an experience yesterday. I was doing a guided meditation 2 days ago, which I do every week. And I just started talking about, the great mystery of existence, what math can't take us there. We don't know. Death, it came into it. And I think it's probably I was influenced by the preparation for this conversation with you. And we talked about it. I can't remember all I said, but when I finished, I had this great sense of peace about existence, about non-existence, about death, the great mysteries that confront us. And I was like, man, I was talking, my soul was preaching to my soul or something. It was coming through, and it really helped. So do you experience that when you're in the zone, and when this presence that you have, this sense of peace and wisdom that you transmit is also coming back at you and helping you in your own struggle with the great mystery of our imminent death?
Well, I'm getting it from you right now, John. I'm really hearing your presence and how all this conversation is impacting you. I mean, teachers always teach what they need to learn, oftentimes, yeah. And I remember when I first started teaching, a dear friend of mine gave me a mantra. He said, this is a very important mantra that you should learn as a teacher. And I waited, for the great wisdom to appear. And the mantra was, I might be wrong. And so I hold that closely, that particular mantra. A while back, after a series of strokes, I was sitting in front of my computer one day, and I looked at the computer, and everything got very pixelated. And it wasn't just on the screen of the computer. I turned toward the wall, and the wall was pixelated as well. And I thought, what is this? Maybe this is some great awakening experience that I'm having, yeah? And then I realized, oh no, something else is happening. So I called my wife at the time, and I said, I think I might be having another stroke. And so she said, okay. And she called 911, and I'll be right there. And I continued to just stay looking at this pixelation. And she got home, and I live on a houseboat, you know, and I have to walk down a long dock to get to the parking lot. And my wife said the emergency techs are coming, and I said, I want to walk down the dock. And she said, you foolish old man, no, just stay still, you know, they'll come with a gurney. I said, no, I want to feel my feet. So we started walking down the dock, and I was quite unstable. I mean, physically, I had to hold on to her and the railings. But internally, there was this great sense of ease and a great sense of love. And I wasn't doing anything, John. I wasn't trying to do metta practice or loving kindness practice or any of these things. It just was there. And about halfway down the dock, I said, just a minute. And she said, no, we have to go. And I said, just a minute. And I looked over the railing into the water. And as I did, everything disappeared. Everything. There was an absolute absence. Different than emptiness I'd experienced before. There was no qualities to this absence. It was before qualities. I don't know how to say it. It didn't feel kind, it didn't feel wise, it didn't feel any of these things. It just was absent of everything. And I remained in that for a while until she grabbed me and said, we have to go to the ambulance. And we went down a little bit further, and I had a grand mal seizure into the arms of the emergency tech. They gave me some medication, took me to the hospital. This was during COVID, so she couldn't come in. And while I was in the hospital, they gave me some more medication. And one of its side effects, I learned later, is paranoia. Now, Roger, you know about these things. I'd never been paranoid in my life. I've been with paranoid people, but it induced this paranoia. And it stayed for a long time. Maybe 2 days. I was so paranoid, I couldn't tell the healthcare clinicians that I was paranoid. And in this state, again, I couldn't stabilize really. So I just started to repeat this phrase. Right now, it's like this. Right now, it's like this. And that was helpful. Ultimately, the paranoia wore off. Maybe I adjusted to the medication, I can't say. And sometime later, I spoke to one of my teachers about it. And I said, you know, suppose this was the moment of my dying. And he said, well, it doesn't, you know, I told him the story I just told you. He said, doesn't surprise me. You had all this love, and you've been cultivating it all these years. Of course you had it. And I said, yeah, but what about the paranoia? Suppose that was the moment of my dying. He said, oh, it'd be okay. I said, okay, what do you mean it'd be okay? He said, oh, when you died, your brain would stop and the paranoia would go away and awareness would return. And it was a little too simplistic for me at the time, but I thought it's a pretty wise teaching, actually. It's a very wise teaching. So I have confidence in this. Yeah? I have a deep confidence in this, in my own experience and when I'm sitting beside someone who's dying. And I think when we can reside in this, and there's more fearlessness, and I don't mean there's no fear, and then I think this is a great aid to people in their dying process. And I would hope to encourage this in the lives of others. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to say the kind of the opposite of that surrender is the contraction that we feel around fear. You know, when you start thinking about our non-existence or dying, I can actually feel kind of my heart closing up. It's definite contraction. And what you're talking about is this surrender and opening, what feels like grace for me. Like I said, I'm pretty God-centric. I talk in those terms, but it feels like something beyond my own dedication to practice and everything. There's something that kicks in that I can't take credit for, but that I'm grateful for.
So imagine in that, John, that God is holding your hand, so to speak, and your heart is hurting, right? It's literally physically hurting, and it's contracted. There's this sense of, oh my, what's going to happen next, right? But imagine if something or someone was holding your hand in that moment, and that something or someone wasn't so afraid. What do you think the influence on you might be?
Beautiful.
So, this is why um, of course, I'm interested in how we care for people at the end of life. This is very important to me, but I'm much more interested in what do we learn from being with dying that can help us to live more meaningful and rich and full lives, purposeful lives. Yeah, that's what really interests me these days. I'm not. I'm a little allergic to the idea of a good death, to be honest. In our culture, we tend to promote this idea, and it's not that we shouldn't try and help people to have ease of pain or ease from certain symptoms, but I'm a little worried that we add on or subject people who are dying to our standard about how it should go,
Yeah.
what it should look like. I mean, I think dying's pretty damn hard. It's hard enough without us adding on to it some spiritual standard about how they should go through it. Um, so I don't have a way in which I think people should die. I've been in with people in all kinds of situations, in all kinds of circumstances, and we die the way we die. I don't think it's true that we die the way we live. I think that's another cliche. I think we just die according to the causes and conditions that are present in that moment. And yes, of course, it can be helpful to have a kind, loving, fearless person next to you. But I don't want to add a bunch of, that's the word I'm looking for. I don't know how people should do it. I just don't want to do that. I think however they do it is fine.
And that feels like one of the central themes of your work and the way you approach death and the dying, Frank, from reading your book. And the five invitations is there's a radical acceptance on your part and radical openness. And I guess that's close to two of the central principles you enunciate in the five invitations. You call them invitations. One could call them principles or suggestions for ways of approaching death and life. And one of them is cultivate, don't know, mind. The other is welcome everything and push away nothing. And it feels like those are very central to this attitude you're suggesting, or the don't know mind about dying. It's like, great, so we brought dying out of the closet, but now but there's a trap at every stage of both individual and cultural development. Now it's like, now we know more about dying and this is a possibility, so we should all have this experience.
Right, and honestly, Roger, it's rampant in spiritual communities.
uh,
And in our transpersonal psychology movements, it's rampant about how we should do it. I was sitting in retreat with someone you know very well, and this person was speaking about the last moment is the most important moment in the dying process. Is a common Buddhist teaching, right? And I went up to this person afterwards and I said, "Can I ask you please to consider something?" And this person said, "Yes, of course." And I said, "Would you please stop telling people that?" and he said, "But it's in the text, and isn't it most important?" I said, "It's very conducive to making people feel guilty, that they didn't do it right, that their mother was on morphine, and should we have given her the morphine or not to manage her pain, and did we cause her to be less conscious, etc." And again, these are idealistic ideas that keep us from being with what's actually happening as it's happening. Yeah.
Yeah. And it feels like that is so central to what I take away from your book and your teachings, is that the being with in an open-hearted way of as you say, don't know mind. It's like, yeah. And that feels like a priceless gift to give someone, free them from our expectations. Remember, Ram Dass once told a story years ago which really stuck with me. He said, imagine you're a person, you're dying and actually I think he said just imagine you're a young mother who's dying, you're leaving a couple of kids, and imagine everyone coming into your room carrying those, their expectations about how tragic this is. And so I thought that really stuck with me as a story. Yeah.
I was with a young woman, late 20s, I think she was, and she had been in a very somnolent state for days, and not eating, not drinking, not speaking, etc. He wasn't in a coma, but not reachable for us. And her mother came to visit, and her mother and her had a very difficult time. Mother had been abusive to her in different ways, and they were estranged. And the mother came and sat beside the bed and said, please forgive me. Forgive me for all the things I've done. I love you. I'm so sorry, and apologize, I think sincerely. And in this moment, this young woman sat up like a rocket, came out of this somnolent stage, looked at her mother and said, I hate you. I've always hated you. And then she died. Now, is that a terrible death, or is it a truthful death?
Roger and I and our team would like to thank you for your support and interest in the Deep Transformation podcast and the ongoing conversation in which we pursue the love of truth, the love of beauty, and the love of goodness, the eternal virtues and verities. If you've been touched and moved by this adventure and journey, we would ask you to press the like button and hit subscribe. It is deeply appreciated and enables us to grow and increase our ability to contribute. Thank you.
Now, is that a terrible death, or is it a truthful death? I don't know, but I know that it was important for this young woman to be able to say that, and it was important for the mother to hear it. And when I worked with that mother over the next several months, it was very important for the mother to work with what her daughter's last words were to her. And the healing that came out of that was important for the mother. Now the challenge for us is, can we just sit still in a room like that? Can we not leap in to save the day? I didn't say a word in that experience. There were no words that could touch that. Yeah? All we can do in such moments is to stay present, to not run away, not leave the room. Yeah? And so, again, I don't have too many ideas about how it's supposed to go, but I have a lot of trust in the dying process, an awful lot of trust in it, and what it can show us. What we were talking about earlier about the chaos and surrender and transformation that's possible in this process that we've become so frightened of. Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the things I took away from your book, and maybe I want to just take a moment here, Frank, and just talk about the book, your book, The 5 Invitations, Discovering What Death Can Teach Us About Living Fully. I've heard about this book, and I think my late wife, Frances, had it. She was one of your faculty members in your end-of-life care counseling training program, but I'd never actually read it. And 3 days ago, I started reading, and I figured, oh dear, I probably won't get through it. But and this book touched me as much as any book I've read in a long, long time. So much so that I dropped everything I could. I stopped writing. I just wanted to get through as much of this book as possible, both in preparation for our dialogue today, but even more for my own. I was so touched by it. I find this an enormously touching, wise, impactful, beautiful work, a distillation of what you've learned. I was very touched by it. I really can't recommend it highly enough. So thank you for that.
Sure. Was there a major takeaway from the experience of reading the book? Because we talked while you were reading it, and we were talking about just what you're saying now, how powerful it was. Is there one thing that you take away from this?
I think there were so many. It's one of those, it felt like this is the distillation of wisdom, of a lifetime of learning from opening to some of the most powerful experiences that human beings can have. And that the wisdom that dying and being with the dying can convey, and its transformational impact, potential transformational impact. And the idea that so much of what we have assumed in our culture about death and dying is wrong, and so much what as you said, Frank, the the tragedy of the way in which death has been medicalized and reduced to a medical event rather than a profound human and interpersonal process and passage. So all of those, and maybe I'll frame this as a question. I was also painfully reminded of how inadequate medical training can be for dealing with the dying, and how unbelievably inadequate it was in my own time. And I've had a very fortunate life, blessed in so many ways. I don't have a lot of regrets, but one of them is I'm getting teary. I deeply regret the way I was inadequate to people who died. I was caring for them.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for all your kind comments. But this moment that you're experiencing now, Roger, I can't speak to what it is for you, but I know when I touch this kind of remorse in myself, it's really important. It reminds me, I like it actually. It's so human. And it helps me to see that I want to know that pain because I don't want to repeat that experience.
Yeah. And I would like for other physicians and health professionals not to have to both inflict what I did on the dying, not in a callous way, but out of ignorance and fear. But and I would like to learn from this myself. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Oh, during the early days of the pandemic, I was working with a lot of emergency room teams in New York and Houston, places where COVID was, out of control. And in those early days, of course, people were dying quickly. And clinicians were in dual roles, where they were not only providing their professional expertise, but they were being the family members, because as you remember, families couldn't come to visit them. And they were a wreck. They were a wreck because they had to open their hearts to fill the role of the family member, and they didn't have the same defenses that they were accustomed to from their professional roles. And so that fourth wall, it was broken, for them. And I sat with them and I said, you guys, you're not normal. And they laughed, and I said, it's not normal to be with people who are dying on a daily basis. And so the normal coping mechanisms that you have are not sufficient to meet the conditions that you find yourself in. You can't go home and just watch Netflix and have a glass of wine. It won't be sufficient. Yeah. To meet that kind of moral suffering that they were experiencing. Yeah. And so I think I have great empathy for physicians, for people with medical training like yourself, who were really taught a particular way of being, which had themselves closing their hearts and cutting themselves off from their humanity, honestly. Yeah, their humanity. And cutting themselves off from the innate wisdom in their good hearts. Yeah. And so much of the work was to help people remember to trust their wise hearts in the course of the work that they found themselves doing. So, it's so hard, isn't it, Roger? It's so hard. Yeah.
Yeah, one of my jobs when I was in graduate school was going around to physicians and having them fill out death certificates. So families could, take care of. But it was called, anyway, it was a really good company. They didn't charge much for their service, and there was a lot of integrity there. Neptune Society, people, I felt I was doing a good thing. But I noticed that the physicians often had hard times. They felt like they were failures, somehow that death was a failure. And it was like, no, I would just try to, comfort the doctors so they could do their paperwork and help this family move along with the process. So,
there is a dear friend of mine, common friend that Roger and I share, Rachel Naomi Remen. She was the author of wonderful books, Kitchen Table Wisdom, My Grandfather's Blessing. And she worked a lot with clinicians. And one day she came to me, she said, "Do you know so-and-so? She's a doctor." And I said, "Yes." I think she was in one of my workshops. She said, "What did you say to her?" I said, "I don't understand. What do you mean?" And she said, now she goes and pronounces people dead in a major big city hospital. And you should understand something about how she does it. And I remembered this one woman coming to me in a workshop and said, "Would you give me some Buddhist rituals that I could do around the time when I'm pronouncing people dead?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Well, why?" And I said, "Because you have to find what your own ritual is. You're not Buddhist, and if you just take on one of those things, it'll just be something else you do rather mechanically." So this young woman, whose, of course, father and grandfather had been physicians, a common experience, went out and got her grandfather's medical bag that he used to go house to house with. Yeah? And she got her father's stethoscope that he had left her. And she went and got this rose oil that her grandma used to make. And she kept them all in this bag and in her locker at the hospital. And when it was her job in this big city hospital to go and pronounce someone dead, she would go and get the bag. And she'd take out her grandfather's leather valise and pull out of it her father's stethoscope and some of the little rose water that her grandma used to make. And she would apply this rose water and say to the person, "I want to let you know that you've died now. It's okay. I will be here with you." And she took out her father's stethoscope, listened for a heartbeat, etc. And this is how she began to pronounce people dead. She found her own ritual with it, yeah. And so I think within medicine, there are people who are doing these kinds of things all the time. It's just that we're not necessarily seeing them. There was a fellow, he was a nurse's aide, basically, and his job was to go into a surgical room, oftentimes, or even a room in the ER, and clean up after the mess when someone had died. And oftentimes what would happen is the person would still be there. And he would go into this room and the room was chaotic and there were bloody rags on the floor and all these kinds of things. But the first thing he would do is he'd go over to the person who died and he'd lean over and he'd say to them, "I want you to know that you've died. And I'm here and I will clean up this mess in the room and the chaos that's here and wash away all dust and confusion." That was his line. Wash away all dust and confusion. Yeah. And of course, the other nurses would peek their heads in the door and say, "Hurry up, we need the room, we need the room," But the supervisor on this unit understood what this young man was doing. And so she'd come and she'd say, "Take your time. It's okay, take your time." Yeah. And I think things like this are happening in medical centers all over the world. And I want to raise a glass, so to speak, to the people who are doing these kinds of things in the midst of what are often very toxic, very difficult environments. Yeah. So I'm very grateful to the people who are working as healthcare clinicians these days, and that they can. Some of them are secretly doing these kinds of things that I'm really grateful for. Yeah. One last thing about this. I was giving a talk, grand rounds at some big hospital in the Midwest. I forget where it was. And so we were walking as the head of nursing was taking me to the theater where I was going to do this talk. I heard Brahms' Lullaby come over the speaker system. And I said, "Oh, what's that?" And she said, "Oh, every time a baby's born in our hospital, we play Brahms' Lullaby." And I said, "You mean just here in the hallway?" She said, No, it goes into every room." I said, "You mean the operating theater goes in there?" "Yes." It goes into the morgue? Yes. It goes into all the offices of the administrator? Yes. And I thought, what a beautiful ritual that this happens. And one day we will have such rituals for when people die as well. And we'll mark death in the same way, I hope. Yeah. Anyway, I'm going on. I apologize.
Oh, beautiful. Yeah.
Maybe you have things that you want to speak to. Yeah.
No, this is beautiful, Frank, and thank you. And what I'm struck by as you speak, and I was also struck by in your book, is how many of the qualities that enable someone to be with the dying in a supportive, helpful way, and in recognition that helpful may mean not doing anything other than being a loving presence. But they're really, they're not professional skills, they're personal qualities and capacities. And that feels, again, part of the difficulty with the medicalization and professionalization is so much of how we think of approaching people and helping people is focuses on techniques and skills as opposed to being with, being human with, etc. This struck me so much in reading about the work with the dying. Love to hear your comment.
Well, thank you for saying that, Roger. And it's things we learn from our grandmothers. Probably not our mothers and fathers. It skips a generation, such things, I think. That kind of humanity sitting in your grandma's lap, you learn about it, you know. Robo-shin, I think it's called in Zen, grandmother love, grandmother wisdom, yeah. So it's the most natural thing. And it's just that we've lost touch with it, and we've so professionalized our care of the dying that we've become frightened, and we forget our innate generosity and wisdom and compassion. You know, Roger, you and I come from, or share a strong Buddhist legacy or practice, and I'm ever grateful for it. Sorry, my mind just went blank for a moment. This is one of the effects of strokes. My mind goes away sometimes. It will come back, it always does.
Sometimes we work hard for this.
Yeah. What I wanted to say is that, well, without going into too much of this, you know, compassionate action, which is, I think, what guided our work at Zen Hospice Project, it works from this understanding, at least in my way of thinking about it, as this kind of boundless compassion that's available to us all the time, you know, and we speak about this beautifully, and the texts speak about it. But then there's this very grounded, everyday compassion, which seems really important. It's when we do stuff, you know, when we feed someone soup, or we, you know, change their diapers, you know, that's everyday compassion. And for me, that has to be rooted in this boundless compassion. Otherwise, we will get exhausted and we will not be able to continue to do it. But that boundless compassion, it needs this everyday compassion. Otherwise, it's just a big idea, you know, it's just a big prayer, and that doesn't help anything in the world, you know. So it's this blending of the universal and the everyday, which seems so important in our work at the bedside. And I don't want to make these things, I'm not romantic about it. Yeah. And I don't think it's the place where we should do a spiritual bypass. I just think it's where that innate quality will emerge most easily in us, because we see ourselves in the other person. And when we do, when we see ourselves in them and we see, you know, them in us, the way in which we care for them fundamentally shifts. It changes. They're not just the object of our care anymore. They become not in some unhealthy emergence, but they become us too. We see our mothers in them and our loved ones in them, and we care for them differently. And I think this has to be part of our medical training going forward. Yeah. Yeah.
I wanted to share experience. I went to live with my parents the last couple of years of their lives.
Mm.
And had a very pure love for my parents. I don't in the forward of my book, I said, all my mistakes are on me, and everybody in grad school said I was in big denial about it, but maybe so, maybe not. But I really made sure that they knew, because I had 2 years to do this, that how grateful I was for all the love they'd given me and the good role modeling of integrity and honesty. And there was nothing left unsaid that needed to be said in that relationship. And Roger and I met and became friends when we were in a conference, and he had just lost his wife, and I just lost my parents, and that's when we connected, Roger. That's when the friendship began, and there was just an emptiness or openness in us that brought us together. So, I would say that's important for your loved ones to don't give them a call or just let them know, don't leave anything unsaid that needs to be said. And I was very, very complete with my parents in that way. And though I still miss them, that really helped.
Yeah, beautiful, John. That's beautiful. I mean, that's a rare experience. It's a rare experience, John. I mean, oh boy. One of the 5 invitations is don't wait. Yeah. Don't wait until your parents are dying to have this conversation. Do it now. Yeah. Do it now. Don't wait to tell people you love that you love them. Yeah. How gorgeous that you got to do that.
Yeah, and I'd sit next to my dad with my arm around him on the couch and hold his hand and just look in his eyes like, Dad, I love you so much. Thank you for being such a great father.
Yeah.
What a gift. Yeah.
It must have changed your experience of their dying deeply for you, John.
Yes, in that there was no unfinished business in that way. It was still a great loss to me, and I still miss them, but there's a tenderness about that, and there's no regrets.
Yeah. Well, of course there's a tenderness, there's grief. And, we haven't talked about this yet, but grief to me is a way we continue to love someone. It's not just our emotional experience of that disconnection. It's a way we love. Yeah. And so we have too many models to try and get people over grief or through grief. I'm a little troubled by those, to be honest with you. How come we're never trying to get people over their joy or over their happiness? I mean, grief is just part of the human condition. Of course, it's a natural response to the experience of loss. Yeah.
I'd like to go back to something you introduced before, Frank, which was possible experiences that beyond the idea of acceptance. You talked about the surrender. And I wondered, are there subsequent experiences that then you've noticed tend to arise for people after an experience of surrender?
Well, of course, there are the things that John was just talking about. When people discover what matters most to them, they tend to act on it. They tend to say things like, well, the only thing that's really important to me is being around the people I love now. So I think those kinds of very pragmatic kinds of realizations emerge. I think there are subtler experiences that occur, Roger, that are difficult to speak about because they're so ephemeral and so they won't subject themselves to our need to prove things. But absolutely, I mean, we can, if we're quiet, if we're still, we can track people's experience. We can track consciousness as it is changing in another person. Many people have great capacity for this. Some of the people I've studied with have that capacity. I don't. I've known it for a little while. I know it in the dying process and for a short time afterwards. So it gives me a confidence that consciousness doesn't stop abruptly when the heart stops or the brain stops. I'm trying to decide how much I want to say about this, because I don't, well, my experience in that tracking is oftentimes of a great stillness. Something is as black as the shirt you're wearing, Roger. There's a kind of peacefulness in it, a velvety quality that I notice in my own consciousness when I'm with someone in that process. That's not to say that there aren't more different states that individual might move through, maybe states that are chaotic or difficult. But oftentimes my experience of them in the first day or two after they're dying is something like a kind of velvety black peacefulness. Yeah. I remember being in Italy teaching at a vineyard, and I talked to people about this, and they said, "Oh no, we don't like this. We like the clear light. We want the blue sky. We want the clear light." And I said, "Well, the black is there too." And they said, "Oh no, that's terrible." They didn't want to experience it. So I said, we were at night, and so I said, "Come outside." And we came outside, and we all laid everybody down on the lawn. And I said, "Look up at the sky. What do you see?" "Stars, wonderful twinkling stars." I said, "Yeah. And what are the stars resting in?" And of course, people began to see this kind of black, boundless quality that was there. And I'm not trying to impose that on anyone, but I'm trying not to have us live with some idealistic idea about what should happen and what will happen after the time of our dying. Yeah. So my experience of that is different than other people's, and certainly others, some of the other teachings that we've both been exposed to. Yeah. I think that one of the experiences that comes out of people's close encounters with death is a quality of gratefulness and generosity. Our dear old friend, Brother David, links those two together very beautifully, into a sense of deep belonging. And I think that I often see that that's one of the qualities that emerge from these deeper experiences of surrender and the like. A deep sense of belonging, not only to their families and friends, but to something larger than themselves that also includes themselves. That's the way I have of speaking about it. That they know they belong. Even when sorry, I'm going on here, but we belong even when we think we don't belong. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the great fears of dying, feeling that we no longer belong, that somehow we're disconnected.
Well, yes, that's true, until that sense of self starts to be stripped away. And when that stripping occurs, the sense of individualized self, the separate self, let's call it, begins to either, again, as I said earlier, be stripped away or gracefully released, then there's something else that starts to emerge. And I think it's this, the walls of Jericho come tumbling down. That's what happens, the walls I've built to protect and prop up this sense of self come tumbling down. And then I feel myself, I can feel myself connected with something that's already there, always there. Yeah. And people have many different ways of languaging this. Yeah. And I'm not interested in imposing my language on it. Yeah. There was a woman, a grandma that I knew. She was, I think, a Christian Scientist. I don't recall now. Anyhow, very, very devout. And her daughter came to see her, young granddaughter, so excuse me, came to see her. And she said, Grandma, I've been reading some books, and after you die, you know, everyone that you love will be there to meet you. So don't worry, Grandma, you don't have to be concerned about this. It will be okay. And Grandma got terrified. Because what she hadn't told the granddaughter, but had told me, was that her husband Edgar had been beating her for the last 5 years of his life until he died. And now the notion of being with Edgar for eternity was terrifying to her. So I'm very careful about not imposing any ideas about what happens after we die. I'm very careful about that. I very rarely ever give advice about it. You know, the Buddha didn't speak about it very much either, come to think of it. But so I'm interested in what people discover in the process rather than giving them my ideas.
Yeah.
So having a great sense of curiosity seems most important. Sorry, Roger, I interrupted you.
No, curiosity mixed with the emphasis you give, and actually one of your 5 invitations of holding don't know mind, and that mystery. And I think I've come to a way of summarizing that for myself, which is trust people who have questions. Be wary of those who have answers, those who have the answer.
So let's talk about that for a minute, Roger. How do you understand don't know mind? How is it, and how can you imagine it being helpful in this time of dying?
Well, I imagine it. And I'd love to have this dialogue. I love your section on cultivate don't know mind, and it feels really important. And feels to me, for me, there's been a deepening appreciation of that we live in. Actually, when we let go of our presuppositions, we realize that we live in bottomless, boundless mystery. And you ask a couple of questions, you're in mystery. And I know that for myself, I spent so much of my life with this very subtle sense, which I didn't recognize. There was something wrong with me. I just didn't understand things. And there was this one moment, I still remember, I was sitting on the living room couch where I realized, oh, wait a minute. The idea that I don't understand things isn't a problem. It's the reality. And it was so freeing. And it was like letting go a burden I didn't even know I'd been carrying. And it feels like it's such a helpful perspective to realize that it's all mystery. And yes, within the mystery, we have to make assumptions and act and be responsible. But to hold it within the context of what you call don't know mind feels, in some way, not knowing goes from being a problem to being a relief.
Beautiful, beautiful. Yeah, I mean, we associate it with ignorance, of course, and it's not. Don't know mind is not ignorance. I'm not encouraging that in some way, you know. And many people think they don't know, but honestly, it would be better if they didn't actually know, you know. That would be better. Yeah. Don't know mind is just, for me, it's just a mind of wonder and curiosity and, you know, Suzuki Roshi's famous beginner's mind, you know. So can you imagine meeting dying with a don't know mind? Instead of one that's fixed and expecting the next, you know, experience to emerge, you know. Don't know, I don't know. That feels so free to me, you know, that when we let go into that uncertainty, you know, that is the most beautiful place to be.
Yeah, I had my first experience of being with somebody that I knew was a big part of my life, died, was my grandmother. And she was a very religious woman. And they lived out, and my grandfather died when I was just an infant. I didn't know him, but I knew her. And they lived out in this farm in rural Louisiana, down in the Cajun country. And every morning she used to sit out on her back porch and do her rosary. You know, that was her time in the morning. That's like the first person I ever knew had a spiritual practice, which I didn't frame it that way now, but thinking back. But she was passing, and her whole family was around her. She was the matriarch. I mean, they had 8 kids, and they had kids, and it was just a big, big family. Um, and I went in to sit with her, and she was actually having visions of family that she's seen. It was like she's really in a blessed state. And this was like 1970 or 71, like that. And I had long hair. I was uh, pretty much a hippie, I guess. I looked like one anyway. And the rest of the family, they weren't unkind to me, but they weren't too comfortable with my long blonde hair. And I had my guitar, and I would sing her songs. I would sing her psalms and stuff that I knew to music. And she was just blissed out by it. Said, I was an angel, and Charles bébé. That's Cajun French for dear child or something like that. And she was so yeah. So my first experience was like, oh, this is not a bad thing. And this may sound a little, like pie in the sky or anything, but that was my true experience with the passing of my grandmother. There was a lot of love there, and and I don't know if that's because she was so beloved, but because she had her own, spiritual connection, and a very devout Catholic, and that she was, I don't know, but it was, I left feeling blessed. I left feeling like I'd been there for something very beautiful, Yeah. And I'm not trying to, take away from the experience, but that was really the experience of it. So,
One of the things that's emerging lately, that's being talked about more, is a kind of terminal lucidity, actually, that happens for people. People who have been sometimes experiencing dementia or confusion of one kind or another through the dying process. Sometimes in the final days, let's call it, moments, there's a kind of lucidity that's beginning to emerge for people, where people can communicate clearly, and they haven't been able to communicate in years. And this isn't magic, and it isn't a miracle, but science is also having a difficult time understanding it. Well, what actually happens that would allow someone to speak clearly when they haven't been able to for years? Yeah. So I don't know. I can't explain it, but I've witnessed it, and it's so much of the mystery that Roger was talking about earlier. Wow, and that your kindness to your grandma could be felt. That's a beautiful thing, isn't it? Yeah.
yes, it was.
We forget about the impact of simple human kindness, I think. We get so caught up in our ideas and protocols and etc. We forget about simple human kindness. Yeah.
Yeah, that's beautifully said. Very simple. Was it Aldous Huxley who said it's somewhat humbling to come to the end of my life and realize I have no better wisdom to impart than try to be a little kinder?
Yeah. No, I think it's really important. For me, at least at the hospice, it was a guiding principle. Just try their best to be kind, and see what the impact is when you do that.
Yeah, beautiful. Frank, for your life has been shaped by your contact and being with the dying. And one of the things that struck me among friends and acquaintances who have worked with the dying in hospice, in your Zen Hospice and other places, has been the frequency with which they report being deeply touched and transformed by the experience. And I wonder, do you have any suggestions for how the rest of us can imbibe of this learning? I mean, not everyone's going to volunteer at a hospice. Most of us at some stage will probably be caring for people who die, and of course all of us will face our own, but as you part of the wisdom you're imparting is it's a good thing to begin this learning process before before we're dying. How can we um, begin this learning process?
Good question, Roger. Let me begin by saying I don't think that caring for the dying is any more important than gardening, actually. I think you could do both with great attention, and there'd be deep learning that would come from either of those experiences. But I think that one of the simple practices we can do is pay attention to endings. You know, how do we end something? You know, how do we end a meal? How do we end a conversation? When we go to one of these conferences that we've been talking about, how do we end it? Do we leave before it's over? You know, what are the lessons we've been taught around ending, and who taught them to us? And do we want to continue to carry them on? You know. So I think paying attention to the way in which we meet endings is really important. The end of this breath, the end of this sentence. And I might add, let's see. I'm struck by what I just said for a moment here. Yeah. How do we love? You know, one of the big questions that's always there in one way or another is for people at the end of life is, am I loved? Did I love well? You know, not in a critical way, but, you know, did I give the love I really wanted to give? And, you know, if those two questions are important at the end of our life, well, certainly they're important now. And so those two practices of looking at the way in which we love and whether we feel ourselves being loved, and watching endings, I think they're important. But also, last thing I'll say on this, pardon me, but I think that this experience of mystery that you referenced earlier is always there for us. And we can open our attention to that, you know. We can open our attention to when we're swept away, so to speak, you know. What's it like in a concert when we enter the mystery through the music that's being performed? Yeah. What's it like when we relax the sense of self a little bit? I think all of these things are preparations for dying. One of the questions I ask people regularly is, do you think that dying will happen later? And, you know, if I'm in an audience of people, everybody's hands go up, of course, everybody thinks it'll be later. Well, you know, impermanence is not later. Impermanence is here in this very moment. You know, it's woven into the very fabric of life. And so if we attend to that, if we attend to the constant change of things, then we won't be surprised by our dying, I think. So, yeah, attending to the constant change of things, not just that the seasons come and go and relationships come and go, but that we ourselves are both here and disappearing. Yeah. And so then we don't hold so tightly to our treasured beliefs and to our fixed ideas about who we are and to our sense of separateness. Yeah. I think these are ways of bringing this into our day-to-day life that give us some of the same experience we have in being with dying, whether it's our own or the dying of someone else. Yeah. I don't know. Maybe those are just words.
Well, maybe they are, but they certainly seem to be pointing to something very important. And you're saying maybe the words, yeah, and all this held within the mystery as we were talking about.
Yeah. I mean, I think in my book I put this in, I don't recall. I was in Japan earlier this year, and at the height of cherry blossom season. Ah, it's gorgeous. You've been there, and it's, these exquisite blossoms that cover the hillside that last only for a few weeks, you know? And, why are those blossoms so beautiful to us? Isn't it the brevity of their lives that capture us, that invite us into their exquisiteness? I think that's part of it, yeah. So, there's a myriad of ways that we can recognize that in our day-to-day lives. And if we don't banish death from life, yeah. If we see that it's a package deal, get born and we die. Shoji, the famous Japanese Zen term, that means life, death. One thing.
When I was talking the other day, I said, mentioned, what if you could have a day of life for every grain of sand on the planet Earth? What a horrifying thought that is. I'm just, oh my God, no. And then I got the inner vision of the wave returning to the sea. I was like, okay, all right, that feels good. And but this guy continuing for ad infinitum is like, it's not what I want either. I think that would be hell. But a wave returning to the ocean is.
Yeah, that's a beautiful metaphor. But, the truth is we rely on impermanence, don't we? I mean, impermanence is not just the ending of things. Impermanence is the law of change and becoming. That's how we can understand it. So we rely on it, right? That cold you have today, it won't last forever. Your knee pain's gonna go away, So it's not just, oh, isn't it horrible that people die? I think we rely on it, if not for impermanence, we wouldn't have the forests. Your children wouldn't grow up to be scientists. We wouldn't have, we wouldn't know the preciousness of this life. Yeah.
Frank, our cultural attitudes have shifted so dramatically with regard to dying. From days of my early medical training when there was so little written about it. Kubler-Ross's book was the big thing. And so there've been dramatic changes, and you've been a pioneer in facilitating those changes. But what more would you like to see in the way of cultural transformation with regard to death and dying?
Well, we have at the local YMCA, we have Red Cross life-saving courses and swimming courses, Wouldn't it be wonderful if we included some ongoing education about this in our life, in our schools? That's the first thing that comes to mind. Suppose we had greater conversations about it. And that's beginning to happen. There are death cafes now, and there's a wonderful program called Death Over Dinner, where people begin to have these conversations where, it's not so forbidden. So I think that's part of the first thing that comes to mind is how do we have the conversation? The second is that there have been experiences like physician-assisted death, which is a kind of shock jock to this conversation. People have more agency now around their dying, and I think that's a good thing. I don't have a moral judgment around this at all, and I think there's lots of ways in which people die, and now this is an option for people in many places in the world, and I'm grateful for it. Yeah.
I have a friend who's a doctor in the Netherlands, and he had done that, assisted people to die. And when he would talk about it, he would just kind of light up like it had been a holy experience and such gratitude from the person that he helped die and the family. It was quite, in his experience. And it just seems like, we want to hold on to life, no matter what the quality and everything. It's like Adyashanti said, we have more compassion for our dogs than we do for human beings when it comes to, assisting them to die in the end. So,
yeah. I mean, what's beautiful about physician-assisted death, whether it's here or elsewhere in the world, is that the choice is living with the person who is going through this experience, the person who's dying. And so I want to make sure that we differentiate it from suicide, that we differentiate it from euthanasia, and it's neither of those things. It is a skillful response sometimes. But even with this, John, I was not long ago with a Zen priest, very well, highly regarded person, and he chose this option. But he was riddled with guilt about it. Riddled with guilt. What will my students think? I should stay longer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so I sat down with him and I said, what do you want people to know? What do you want from people at this moment now? And he said, well, I want to be loved and I want to be respected. And I started writing these things down on a piece of paper. And of course, we came up with a long list of very simple things. I want to be loved. I want my judgments to be understood. The choices I make to be understood. And we came up with this long list, and I made a kind of poster out of it, and I hung it on his wall. And so everybody that came into his room saw that list before they saw him. And so it became a kind of preparation for being with him. And then the way in which they were with him changed substantially. And as a result of their kindness, his guilt began to subside. Yeah. In the Tibetan tradition, there's something called proximate karma. Yeah, and it's a complicated thing, so we won't go into it. But basically, it means what's in the neighborhood. Yeah, what's in the neighborhood. So when someone is dying, they might be in utter confusion. But if you are sitting there next to them, John, and your mind is somewhat clear, your heart is somewhat open, that can be a huge aid to that person in their dying process. So in this case, it was students beginning to understand and love their teacher anyway, regardless of his choices. Yeah. So I think that this is a great boon that's come into our culture. I also think that this possibility that, we might have better drugs to give to people than sedation. There's a lot of work going on around psychedelics, et cetera. People exploring this in the months before dying. And I think there's some value in this exploration. I think if we have some experience of more expanded states of mind in our life, they can become reference points for us in the experiences that we meet in the dying process. I don't think what happens in psychedelics and dying are the same thing. I don't equate them, but I think they could be useful tools in helping us to meet the profundity that we will encounter in the time of dying.
That we are beyond our egos. There's something much bigger.
Well, there's at least a possibility of this, who we are, experiencing ourselves as something larger. It's not that we're going to kill the ego and get rid of it. I don't know who wants to do that. The awareness doesn't need to kill the ego. But when we have a more expanded quality of awareness, we know ourselves to be that in addition to, we could say. In addition to.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And it does seem that there is now significant research showing that the psychedelic experience can be very valuable for people with, for example, fear, existential confrontation. So both many people's individual experience plus solid research seems to suggest the potential value in at least some people. Yeah.
Absolutely. That seems to be the case, and there's been good studies on this, and so, but I'm concerned about it because I don't want it to be another bypass that we use. And I don't necessarily want these medications, if you will, to be in the hands of untrained people, untrained facilitators, I mean, or physicians, for example, that are not familiar with their impact. So I'm very cautious about how we would use these things. I think they could be valuable in the months before dying, actually.
Yeah. And I definitely want to honor your cautions, because tragically, as at least in the preliminary stage, and with, for example, ketamine, the use of ketamine, it's now being used as a psychedelic for a variety of purposes, and the research is clear. It can be very valuable, for example, with PTSD or with depression, but it is being used as a moneymaker in some clinics and not done with the kind of psychotherapeutic support or appropriate training that you're suggesting. So thank you for pointing to those safeguards.
Yeah,
Frank,
I think it's important.
Frank, as we kind of come towards the end here, you've done, just to acknowledge the beauty of the work you've done and how much good has come out of just your being with the dying in a very open, learning, don't know way. And so much has come out of that. As you seem to have let go a lot of personal agendas and so forth. We're all works in progress, but is there anything else you would love to people to know or to be able to do yourself or teach?
Hmm. Ramdas, our buddy, we talked together quite a lot. And we were doing some workshop, I don't recall where, and I began to speak about the experience of bathing the body of someone after they die. And this has happened in every culture and every tradition for millennium. Yeah? And there's something so beautiful about it, and of course there are rituals for doing this in various traditions, but we can also create our own rituals around these things. And my experience has been that this is extraordinarily beneficial to family members and friends or to medical professionals after there's been a death, because we put aside all the things of medicine, we put aside all the things having to do with sickness, and we just care for this person in the most loving, simple way. And my sense of what occurs after that is that people's relationship to dying shifts, because they're literally touching it. They're literally touching death. And it's not as frightening as they imagined. Yeah? So I think I would like to invite these kinds of rituals back into our experience of the dying process, including in hospitals. People often get a cursory bath after they've died. But what would it be like if the staff had an opportunity to bathe them in a ritual-like way to say goodbye, or family members were invited into that process? Maybe it seems too far out for your listeners, but I think this one single action could fundamentally shift our relationship to dying. And when Ramdas and I were teaching together, he asked me that question that you just did, and that was my answer then, and it continues to be my answer now. Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah, Frank, it seems that one of the thrusts of this whole conversation is that our culture is just not dealing well with death. And I know some cultures that are much more Native American and say Jewish, Orthodox, and different ones where life and death are very much accepted and honored and sacred. And we've cut ourselves off from that and impoverished ourselves. So thank you for the work you're doing and how you touch me. Preparing for this conversation and being part of it's been a great honor and a great blessing. Thank you.
Been a big joy for me, and thank you for your tenderness also, John. I appreciate your including that in this in our conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, and likewise for me, have been deeply touched by reading your book, and I want to again emphasize what an exquisite book this is: The 5 Invitations, Discovering What Death Can Teach Us About Living Fully. And I also want to just point to something you said in passing in your last comment about what you hoped you might yet be able to communicate further, and you emphasized the beauty of washing a body, and you also said making a ritual around this. And one of the things I take away is from this is our conversation is the importance of creating our own rituals for life transitions, and for the final transition of death. So that's been a particularly powerful thing I will take away among many others. Frank, I just want to thank you so much for what you've done, the heart and spirit with which you've approached this work, and the way in which that don't know mind, open-hearted, bringing the fullness of your being to the experience of being with the dying and the living has impacted me, John, and our culture. This is a priceless gift, and I hope you know just how, and can let in just how much good you've done. You've really transformed a lot of people and saved a lot of people enormous amount of suffering. So thank you.
Thank you for your kind words, Roger. And I want to just applaud you and John for doing this program. That now our words, our conversation will go out to thousands and thousands of people, and you're influencing how we as a culture begin to think about this. So I'm very grateful that you've done this. Thank you for doing it. Yeah.
We're grateful for the opportunity too. Yeah. Frank, thank you so much. John, thank you so much. Thank you, Heidi Mitchell, who is our podcast producer, and Vanessa Santos, who is our technological whiz. And thank you all for listening and being with us and making this podcast and conversations possible.